Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's installation of advice for public speaking. We are nearing the end of our class, so these are getting, I would say, the last pieces. I would say the last ones are trying to make you aware of sort of other directions, other possibilities that you might not have thought of. And if you noticed last time, there was something reflexive about what we discussed. We were talking about this idea of the speaker listening to him or herself, right? So that leads to this a certain self awareness. So that's a dimension, notice, that we kind of save for the end because it's a little bit. It's not really, in a sense, we could say that it's not really central, right? To it might not thought to be central to most speeches, but it can be, if you really think about it, it can be really much more at the heart, or sort of a part of the what makes your speech kind of click, right? It can kind of be something that, as opposed to just sort of being on the periphery, something that's sort of a sort of removed attitude. It could be actually sort of a source to how you speak. So in the same way, today we're gonna talk actually about seriousness, like how serious do your speeches have to be? Do they have to be serious? Can your speeches be a joke? And this is in a sense a continuation of what we saw last week. Because they have to do with you sort of listening to yourself speak, in a sense, being sort of aware of what this of the larger context of what this speech is. Because, for example, on one level, we might think that these speeches are, you know, uh, you can be a little bit, as we sort of commonly say, philosophical about it. You can think of speech giving, in the great scheme of things, as being, not really so important if you think of the great events in the world, right? And so that ironically, that sort of that awareness, or that way of looking at what you're doing, might actually make your speech. It could, it doesn't necessarily, but it could make it be more credible, because we get the feeling that there's a paradoxically a sort of an honesty about that. You might think that this what the speech you're giving is not very serious, because you're sort of honest about the whole situation, about sort of, if you take a few steps back and you look at sort of the overall importance of what you're doing, that might sort of show that you have a sort of a fairly wide perspective, right? So we're gonna kind of ask that question of the seriousness of the speech. The possibility of having sort of a more whimsical speech that might be, less serious, less sort of forthright. And this is going to lead us to sort of questions about sort of the personality of the speaker. What this goes hand in hand with. Let's say if you're, as a speaker, are going to give a sort of a whimsical, lighter speech. It would be a sort of a lighter side of yourself, right, that you are presenting, right? And so the question is also, is that really you? Or are you, you, how much could you perhaps pretend to be someone else? Um, so those two questions are kind of intertwined, and they are going to be the ones that we're going to look at. So about this question of seriousness, I think a good reference to keep in mind is how you can sort of be effective and not necessarily serious is, think about Oscar Wilde. One of his plays is called, The Importance of Being Earnest. And, Oscar Wilde, late Victorian writer, Irish writer, and he's throwing up this whole idea that this is a real value of his times. This whole For Victorians, it's very important to be earnest, very very serious and very forthright and very honest. The whole business, right? Okay, and this is a sort of very prized value in his society, right? So the play, I'm not going to go into details about what the play discusses, but what is central to this play is one of the characters. His name is Ernest, and he's not very honest, and he's not very forthright, and so on. And the tone of the play is generally playful, right? So there is something to be said for, and the play actually comes off in that way. So there is something to be said for, and and part of this has to do with, we could say Oscar Wilde's sort of intelligence, and that makes it a little bit more lively, right? Because seriousness, right, um, generally has a sort of the monopoly on sort of values, and it sort of seems to sort of, in a sense, have the monopoly of sort of, I would say, the moral compass of, I would say, on questions of society, right? It seems like the more serious people are the ones who have the real answers, and so on, right? And that is something that might be called into question. That you can, in a sense, call that into question if you don't think so, right? If you don't think so, you can, speech making can be a place for you to play with that, right? And to call that into question, to give another sort of provide another way of looking at life, or to openly ask a question. Is it really the serious ones that understand and have all the answers? So that could be something to work on. So and this means that you're going to have a different kind of connection with the audience. Now, we looked a little bit at the founders of rhetorics, because these are the we looked at the Greeks, and we looked namely at Plato and Aristotle, and how they were amongst the first to really theorize on making speeches in public. And one of the aspects that Aristotle, now his book called the Rhetorics, in his book he talks about the importance of the ethos of the speaker, right? And that is sort of, the ethos would be sort of like the fact that the speaker is sort of morally upstanding and honest and forthright, right? And all these, we could say, in a sense, earnest, right? And he says that this leads the audience to lend credence to what the speaker says. We have the feeling that if this speaker is sort of ethically sound and recognized to be ethically sound, right? Then that's very important for you to make your arguments. So that's an essential part, notice, for Aristotle, as far as the connection, right, with the speaker and the audience is. The person who is sort of has this quality of ethos, right, who is sort of ethically sound, according to Aristotle, that is the kind of speaker who is going to connect with the audience. But it might be that is something that you can be critical of and call into question. And ironically, for example, in other times where, let's say, this is something that is often referred to as legitimacy crises, and this is something that the 60s are a lot about. We have writers such as Thomas Kuhn talks about this, or Habermas, they talk about this thing called the crisis of legitimacy. And this is following some disillusionment about the Vietnam War. We could also, often this is after wars, right? We can think of like the Surrealists and Dada after World War One. We can think of I don't know, the beat writers in the United States as a reaction to World War Two, or later we can think about a lot of sort of movements. Even we could talk about someone like Guy Debord in 19 in the 60s, and these are times where the sort of the sort of supposed to be the common core values of society are kind of called into question, right? And very very often at times, like so this is obviously not the kind of a society that Aristotle is talking about in his rhetorics, right? So you might consider that you are giving a speech in a day and age where these sort of, I would say, the values of honesty and forthrightness are, you might be skeptical about those values. You might think that, and we could perhaps, you might say that, people like politicians, they have, in a sense, devalued this notion of a forthright person talking about these things in public, right? That these values no longer hold currency, right? Because they've been sort of debased and sort of abused. So that might lead you to sort of call in this whole question, this idea of being serious and giving a serious speech. And of course, this is linked to the fact that we are in a university setting, right? And this is a class that you are taking to get credits at an institution, right? So there is it depends on who your teacher is, of course. I would like you to perhaps play with that. Be aware, try to ask yourself how you can. I mean, it almost goes to Andy Warhol's famous quotation where he says, "Art is what you can get away with." Um, I'm not saying you can get away with anything, right? But if what you're doing involves a sort of a reflection, right, on I would say it's a serious act. You need to give two speeches to get a grade, right? And if you what your speech uh, is aware of that constraint and can in a sense play with it, right? The idea is to sort of try to encourage you if you would like to encourage you if you would sorry there was something that fell encourage you if you would like to be playful. You can do that, right? You can do that. So let's look on to the the second part about this, of course, that is linked is that if you're going to be playful, one dimension of that is likely to come into play will be this question of being who you really are when you speak. Now, conventional wisdom, and it's true, it's a little bit more natural, right? Is when you go to speak in front of people, that part of that we could sort of think of there being a contract, sort of that usually the idea is that it's your real self that's going to be up there, and part of this has a lot to do with the fact that in this situation, right, the people, of course, we are in our social isolation setting, so it's a little bit obviously we have to adapt, and you have to take what I'm saying with a pinch of salt. But you're in a situation here where you have some of the people, right? Most I would think people in the class they know you and you know them, so you're not. It's going to be it would be in a sense impossible to really pull off the stunt, right? And you can think of your speech being, how far can this speech be a stunt of sort of pretending you're someone else, sort of playing a character, right? And that would very likely, you can think of, I would say, I'm going to send you links to some I mean, it's, we're seeing as we're talking about being playful. I'm going to send you some links to some skits by Sacha Baron Cohen. I talked about him when I talked about Socrates. His sort of this idea of pretending you're someone that you're not, right? And that can really very often be a part of being of this sort of playfulness, and it's also that's a one way of in a sense being critical of, or I would say more sort of reflecting on this whole scenario of coming up in front of people and defending your opinions, and which is what most of these speeches are doing. That they're good speeches, right? That's what I've been telling you to do. But usually this sort of we sort of take it for granted. Let's say that we sort of take it for granted that when you go to give a speech, that you are going to be yourself. For example, that your emotions are the kind of real emotions that you feel, and that is sort of in a sense what we might think the contract is, right? That's sort of what normally we might sort of assume the contract is between the speaker and the listener, right? And yet there is sort of another contract, is once again to go back to what we said about this sort of openness of what I'm asking you to do. And I talked about Henry James, his famous criticism on fiction writing, and where he sort of criticizes a writer a critic, he criticizes a French critic, who sort of claims to come up with a recipe, a sort of a set of fixed guidelines for writing good fiction. And Henry James says, wait a second, it just has to be interesting. So we might sort of assume that, the recipe for having this connection, because that's as we said in the beginning, the idea is to you want to make something happen, right, between the speaker and the audience. The sort of necessary formula, right, for assuring that this connection is made is that you are forthright and you present yourself as you really are. And to be honest, that's I think the best idea most of the time, because we talked a lot about intonation, a lot of the fact that you're trying to convey emotions, and it's very likely that the emotions that you feel are going to be sort of authentic, and that you're going to want to convey those, right? But on the other hand, you might think of another aspect as of you in sort of pretending. You can kind of play, right? You can kind of pretend to be, and this you can take this to. I'm not saying you necessarily have to be an imposter, but there is sort of the personality is a little bit fluid, and in this specific context, right? There might be, in a sense, other elements of your personality that come out that won't come out in sort of an everyday setting, right? And that means that this whole idea of being truthful to being true to yourself and being who you really are, um, it isn't maybe as cut and dry as we think, right? In the beginning, I've been presenting this question as sort of a question of yes or no. Either you present yourself as your true self, or you pretend to be someone else. That's a sort of a simplified version, but if you think about it, what you might want to say is that you in a given, and this is sort of the work of sociologists that refer to this quite a bit, but this idea that in a given context, right, you're sort of playing a role, and there's a certain aspect of your personality that will come to the forefront. And you should also be aware of the fact that yes, that actually when you give a speech, there's going to be another one that's going to come for the forefront, right? And it might feel like it's the real you, but the question that you might ask yourself, is this really the real me, right? So, and the idea is, it's up to you you can either sort of accept it's also open to interpretation. Either you really feel like you are always really you in all contexts, and this kind of question doesn't interest you, and that's great. Or it literally is perfectly fine. I mean, what I'm saying, this is something to keep in mind, once again, it's this to sort of see how this works for you is what's going to be interesting or not. Or you might look at this and think, well, I have certain friends that see me in one way, I act one way with them, and act another way with them, and I'm likely to appear in a certain way when I'm it's another side of myself that is sort of visible in this certain situation. Is this very unusual situation, which is giving a speech, right? And in a sense, you might feel ill at ease because you might not feel that it's the real you, right? And you might want to sort of, in a sense, not take chances with that. And that's, once again, that's perfectly fine. This is all up to you. But you might want to take liberties with that and play with that, pretend to be someone. And that is the real question is, how you still want the speech to go off. You want it to be interesting. You don't want it to be sort of like a bad joke, right? But this idea of the contract, right, between the speaker and the audience, you can displace that to being the sort of I would say the conventional one, whereas you are sort of expected to be who you really are. Because this question of who you really are is, as I said, I mentioned sociologists like a sociologist such as like Irving Goodman is really good at analyzing this kind of this idea that the personality is socially constructed, given the situation, and also you might be inspired by I would say the contribution of psychoanalysis, right? We have the Freudian approach, where this whole idea of the self, right, which is a very kind of a more fixed and stable notion, let's say, starting from John Locke, right, in the 17th century, where John Locke has this idea that the self is really equated with everything that you remember, right? And it's usually in the 17th century, it's a very kind of cerebral thing, right? It's sort of almost equated with reason, right? So it's sort of the reasoning individual. What are you as a reasoning? And the self is really a reasoning individual, and what the individual remembers doing. So this is how John Locke answers, for example, questions about, let's say, when you're dreaming, it's not, is this really you? And the questions like this. Now, Freud uh, tends to think of the self as sort of a sort of a three-story house, right? And you're kind of negotiating between the different stories, right? So it's sort of a more composite, complex thing. There's this, there is the, the superego, the id, and this is the unconscious. I'm sorry, the subconscious. So you're kind of negotiating between these things. That I'm not going to go into a whole class on psychoanalysis. That would be interesting, but just to say that, in today's day and age, and this is old stuff. Freud is, it's more than 100 years old. So in today's day and age, you might be able to take liberties with this idea of being earnest and giving a serious speech. You might want to take that other places. So I'll send a few links to Borat. I think that's kind of funny, right? Because he kind of does that, and that might give you some ideas. This, once again, take this for what it's worth, and if this you find that this could give your, this could help you to have an idea for a speech, go with it. Have fun with it, right? So take care. I hope you are bearing well with this week, these times which are slightly difficult. So take care.